Hi, this is Justin Coletti. You may know me from Sonic Scoop, but today I'm with Plugin Alliance, and I am talking to an artist, producer, mixer, remixer. He does a whole bunch of stuff. His name, Hannes Bieger. And Hannes has been, I'd say, working on some of the most interesting and with some of the most prolific and interesting electronic music artists, particularly in Europe, but really all around the world. He's based in Berlin, where we're speaking to him now. Hannes, thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You can see over Hannes's shoulders lots of gear, some beautiful analog synths, including the Knifonium, which is that pretty flashy one right there over his right shoulder, which is now being modeled in plugin form by the guys at Plugin Alliance, who are helping us do this conversation. So, Hannes, again, welcome. And how are things in Berlin, Germany today?
Well, I'm good today. I had a fun afternoon at the studio with a very, very beautiful instrument right next to me. And it's always great fun checking out new synthesizers, new stuff, and just getting lost in the sound and in the music.
Can you give me a sense, first and foremost, just because Knifonium is a great excuse to talk about today because this new plugin is coming out. Can you tell me the actual analog hardware Knifonium behind you? What do you think was most resonant about to you? Where do you think it excels? And what do you think makes it unique compared to maybe other synths that you'd have in the studio with you?
Basically, first of all, this obviously isn't the thing that matters the most, but it's the one that meets the eye. At first, it's basically the physical presence that it has, like the way it's been made with the ebony keys and all this kind of stuff. It's really, if you touch it and if you play it, it feels very nice and very solid, which is always great for me because I started out as a guitarist. So I was taking my baby steps in making music, having a solid piece of wood and metal in my hands, and this is something that I'm still in a way seeking when I'm dealing with synthesizers. So in terms of hardware, this thing is right where I want to have it. And then, of course, sonically, it was really interesting to see. I think it has something like 26 tubes inside. It was really interesting to play it shortly after switching it on, and then after it being warmed up after 1 hour or so, it really changed once more. I mean, it was beautiful from the beginning, but then it started to sing, really. There's something about the sound which is difficult to put in words, but I said it earlier to the guys here, it's quite an emotional instrument in a way. Like it pulls you in and you start playing it and you start tweaking the notes, and it's quite otherworldly and spherical sounding, but then it's also very crunchy and very like almost like a glossy version of a Korg MS-20 or something like that, which is a bit misleading maybe because the MS-20 is just such an aggressive and nasty, I mean, in a nice way, but it's a nasty sounding synth. And the Knifonium can sound nasty also, but there's a whole different world to discover also.
Right. Yeah, just playing around with and hearing a lot of sounds of the software version of the Knifonium, it reminds me of like kind of a sweet, small tube guitar amp, like that kind of saturation. Maybe not the super aggressive, crunchy saturation of certain amps, maybe less a Marshall head, but it has this saturation that's not aggressive, but is, sings, like you say. So
yeah, it sings, really, right. Yeah, it's maybe it's even more like the blues harp through the small amp, like the guitar. But yeah, it's in a way that can also be misleading because you can crunch it up and you can drive it, but you don't have to. And there's a very, very soft kind of eerie thing to it that it can do also, which is far from the overloaded small Fender Champ blasting away.
Right. But the one last question about technology is I do see all this beautiful analog hardware behind you, a lot of stuff with tubes in it, a tape machine, these analog synths, but I know you also use a lot of digital tools as well. Can you give me a sense for what the split is like there? Are you half and half, or are you leaning on digital tools for certain kinds of jobs? Even in a studio like yours with all that lovely analog gear, how are digital tools part of your workflow?
Well, first of all, I have to say, why would I not? Right? I mean, these days with digital having come such a long way, I think one would be stupid to ignore what's available there. I mean, I think it's a really great situation that we can now just really pick what suits us the most outside the. I mean, for a long time there was a big analog versus digital discussion, and I think these days it doesn't really matter so much anymore. Of course, there's certain aspects where it really can still make a big difference, but then there's other aspects where it doesn't just as much as it used to do. And so for me, basically, the longer I'm in this game, the more I realize that it's really, I mean, of course, I'm operating equipment as part of my daily work, but this is not where I limit my role to. I'm not a machine operator. I'm a creative person. I'm an engineer. I'm a producer, and I'm basically shaping sonic sculptures. And I'm doing this with the tools that I consider the best for the job. And so for me, these days there is no rule anymore in terms of this has to be analog or this has to be digital. And then of course it depends on the given situation what I do. I mean, I really enjoy surgical EQing in the box with plug-in EQs, because this is something where you can I mean, I have a ton of analog EQs, but I almost never use them to cut frequencies, because most EQs that I'm having have stepped controls for the frequencies, which means you never hit the right one. And it really does make a difference whether when you have a resonance in the kick drum at 160 hertz, I don't want to EQ it at 220 or 120 or something like that. And so I really enjoy the control. And also, I've never really been a drum machine person. Mm-hmm. I really like to work with software samplers for my drums, because I like the very precise control about the tuning and the envelopes and all this kind of stuff. And it's also convenient to do this in the computer, not in little display menus on a hardware box. And so there's couple things where I really prefer digital over analog anyway. Yeah, it depends on what you want to do and how you want to get there. And like I said, today, I mean, we're happy that we have a choice.
Mm-hmm. Now, quick question just to push you for a couple more specifics on this general topic. The Knifonium that's there behind you, you've made a great case for how that physical beast is this beautiful organism with the walnut wood, the ebony key is a great thing to physically interact with. In that particular case, could you see any advantages to the software? I mean, the most obvious one is you got an $18,000+ synthesizer behind you compared to, at most, few $100 plugin. But are there any other ways that you could see the plug-in version of it being a great complement, even if you happen to have an $18,000 analog synthesizer in the studio with you?
Well, the great thing about plug-in versions of analog hardware synths, obviously, is that you have preset memory. It's a two-sided thing, because if you have a synth which doesn't have preset memory, you have to really understand it. And especially if you want to recreate a sound without taking photographs or something like that, you really have to understand what makes the sound the way how it does, because only then you can really recreate it. But at the same time, of course, especially if you want to work fast, and I really like working fast, dialing in a completely different sound on a complex machine like this is a difficult thing. And then, of course, just pressing a button on the screen and having an entirely different sound coming up in an instant is very, very nice thing to have.
That's an absolutely great point, and it's something that I don't think everyone who hasn't played around with analog synths might recognize, because an analog synth, you walk over to that, and whatever sound you last left at it, maybe it's a long sustaining lead sound. Well, now if you want to get to more of a pizzicato sound or a bass sound, you've got to move 5 or 6 different knobs, and switches to get you in that direction. But on a software version, you pull up your preset for bass, and even if you're not going to use that bass preset sound, you're at least in a starting place where the envelopes are shaped in such a way where, okay, we're in the right territory. We're an octave down. We have the right general attack and sustain. Now let's tweak and create things from here. So even just to give yourself quick starting points to jump from one sound to another, so much quicker digitally than all the knob turns you'd have to do to make that happen on an analog device.
Right, and sometimes this is great because if this lead sound that you just described is still on the synth, you start noodling around and then you get distracted, and maybe you wanted to do a bass line, but now you're in lead synth mode
Right.
already.
Yes.
And so, I mean, this can be a source of the happy accident that I mentioned.
Sure.
But sometimes it's just distracting, and then if you bring up a sound that's more similar to what you want to create already, then this can be better in terms of keeping you in the workflow that you were in. But then also, yeah, I mean, this is not so much an example for the Knifonium, because no matter if you look at the hardware or the software, it's quite accessible and fairly easy to understand what it does. But one example where I have an interesting hybrid workflow between software and hardware actually is the TB303. The famous Roland Acid synth, because I really like the sound so much, and I'm very happy about my hardware unit, and I think it does something that is just ultimately you can't replace it with a plugin. But then again, programming lines on it is so unintuitive and so difficult to do, and especially if you want to scrap it and do it over, or if you have something that is almost there and you want to modify it, it's if you really need to master this in order to be fast with it. And what I sometimes do is that I'm writing my lines on a plugin, a 303 plugin, because it's just you can visualize it better, and it's just more convenient. And then when I have something that I'm happy with, I rebuild it with the hardware and record the final version. So this would be one example where software and hardware actually go hand in hand, and where the software really has a big edge over the hardware for me.
Right. In some cases, being able to program things within the computer environment. And I guess that could potentially carry over to certain synth lines as well. I mean, I know that you really love to play and engage with the instrument, but I could imagine for a lot of people, there being some cases where there's something that would be very difficult for them to play, but they know that they could program it in using the piano roll very nicely. And that's a potential advantage there for people who love sounds, but are, not as accomplished musically as you are with their fingers, that they may be able to get some additional benefit out of software versions that way, potentially. Of course, there are step sequencers and things in the hardware domain, but you've got to admit that to a degree, it's nice to have all of the control you'd find inside of a computer. One last thing I'd bring up with the Knifonium specifically, as you mentioned, it has 20-something tubes in it, and all of those tubes are necessary to get monophony, one voice, right? So I know that this synth version, you can get multiple voices, because if you tried to turn that into a polyphonic device, analog, it would be like, almost the size of your studio to fit in all of those additional tubes and things. So I guess that's another thing that would come up to me.
I wanted to mention this anyway, because this was one of the turning points where I really thought that the Knifonium plugin has a huge edge over the hardware. That was when we switched on the polyphony, and when I played a sound that started out more like a Rhodes piano texture, and then the notes started to overlap and spill into each other, and then I started to do my modulations on top of that. And this is really, this opened up another world for me, basically. And this is something that like you said, it's impossible with the hardware, which needs all this circuitry to just generate two monophonic oscillators, and then you basically open up the menu on the plugin and you can choose how many voices you want to play, and it's like it's luxury. It's luxury, and of course you start to play different things with it then, and it's very, very nice also. So I found this a very, very important point where the plugin is actually doing something that you can't do with the hardware.